when you have these major events that are happening, well, that are historic in many ways, and bring about excitement and, how do you avoid or should you avoid placing a narrative over what
I think
is
you
happening?
should. I think people should avoid. I think journalists should be. They don't have to be. You don't have to be. You don't have to stand with evil. You don't have to do. You don't want to be balanced to the point that you're horrible. That you say something or write something that's totally obnoxious. For example, the government. 300 people died in the demonstration. The government denies it, or something like that. You don't want to write something or say something that is horrible, that is defending or giving credence to an act which was extremely violent or a massacre or something. But you have to be balanced. You have to be. It is worth it. It is worth it to take the extra effort to go get a glass of water and cool down, and don't side totally with one particular cause or issue.
But that's a difficult thing to do. Let me just give an example, and maybe we have to scratch this at the end too, but for the sake of the conversation. Okay, let's say, let us look at what happened in Iran in 2009. Okay, there was an election, and there were, people came into the street, and in the span of about 8 months, about 150 people were killed, and about 4,000 people were arrested.
Way more than that.
Okay,
but anyway.
Okay,
yeah.
These are the numbers. Let us say, I don't know, how many, 10,000? Do you have the...
Arrests?
And it's continuing.
Yeah, it's continuing.
It's continuing. And we identify that as a very violent, autocratic response. In a span of 2 weeks in Egypt, how many people were killed?
350. Yeah.
And we have essentially identified that as a nonviolent, event. Okay. Now, as I said, this might have to be scratched because I don't want to in any way be. I'm just trying to see, as a journalist, do we have a response, as somebody who reports, do we have a responsibility to correct that narrative by giving the context that, 2 years ago, correctly, we identified that one as a very violent, repressive response, and for some reason in this situation, we are not. Or Tunisia, for example, which has been identified as something very quick and very, some atrocious things have happened in the beginning that are just coming out in various cities, not at the center. And to report it just like that without giving it context.
I think in that particular situation, I think, but the reason why the media is describing the protesters as not violent. The protest movement the government responded violently, but the protesters, for the first time, and I think the interesting there is the first time in recent Arab history, people non-violently overthrew a regime. There wasn't tanks, because as we know in the Arab world, usually successions are like in Iraq, where the tanks move into the presidential palace and take over and so on. I think in that sense, I think that we when we talk about non-violent revolution, we mean it in terms of how the revolutionaries behaved.
Mm-hmm. So, but the context again, that is not, because there is so much comparison is made to the Iranian situation. That is not the way, I guess, is perceived, and so. Does the journalist have the responsibility to give that context? And
absolutely.
By just remaining silent about this issue, again, the question of what is being hidden, not necessarily the question of whether or not journalists are taking sides or another, is what is it that is not being said, and how important that is when it is not being said in terms of giving a context to the events that are happening.
But you saw recently everyone called the Obama administration on the fact that 2 demonstrators were killed in Bahrain.
Exactly.
And the U.S. was, calling on the Bahraini government to show restraint. And then 2 demonstrators were killed in Iran, and Hillary and Obama were lambasting the Iranian regime for its violent crackdown against. But the journalists called them on that. I know our Washington correspondent was talking to me about that issue, and I saw a story in the New York Times about that very issue. So there's ways of addressing it. Maybe you do it as a separate story, 2 demonstrations, instead of the main story about what happened in Iran and Bahrain. You would do a separate story about how the hypocrisy of the administration.
So maybe one of the things that have happened is actually the events in the region are so overwhelmingly historic that they are actually forcing us to face our hypocrisies in terms of the dynamics of the regions, that you cannot really support. I mean, we already talked about you cannot really support autocracy and talk about democracy. And I guess the irony of 2 people being killed on the same day in Bahrain and Iran was just too much that we simply could not ignore that reality and act as though the administration was taking a consistent position.